Hello and welcome to the UFO Mystery Podcast. My name is Roger Stankovic, and today we've got a special guest, Jeff, or better known by his Reddit handle, Harry is White Hot. And we're going to be talking about numerous alleged classified documents that have been leaked since the 80s. And we'll also be discussing their authenticity and how they're connected to the deaths of certain prominent figures in the 60s, including the assassination of John F. Kennedy. We'll also be looking into the nuclear connection, the UFO nuclear connection, and how an incident that occurred during a high-altitude nuclear test called Bluegill Triple Prime incident in 1962 ties into this discussion. So before I introduce you, Jeff, I'm just going to talk a little bit about myself, but not too much. So my interest in this field started in the late 80s, about 34 years ago, when I went and purchased this book, Above Top Secret. There was only one copy left in New South Wales, and so I had to rush up to the Central Coast. It was found in a bookshop in the Central Coast. Purchased it and flicked through it because I knew there were classified documents in it that were never released before, and Timothy Good being the author. So I sort of like went straight to the appendix and found a document which we could term as the Eisenhower briefing document, which was obviously made to update Eisenhower in '52 when he took office as the president of the United States about the UFO phenomenon, and also what happened at Roswell. So that's how I began, and so apparently a lot of the documents first came to Jamie Shandera in his mailbox as an undeveloped 35mm Kodak film, which he was surprised to find in his mailbox, and he developed it, and these were some of the first documents that Stanton Friedman and Moore and a few others had worked with. So I sent this document to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and just requesting the provenance of the document, and they sent me back a very quick snail mail letter saying that they don't investigate UFOs anymore. And much later, I looked at various documents that were leaked by a researcher called Timothy Cooper through unknown sources, some of them referring to suspicious deaths of Marilyn Monroe and a reporter by the name of Dorothy Kilgallen, both of whom were connected with the Kennedys. So that's enough about me. So Jeff, how are you today?
Very good, Rog. Thanks for having me on there today. I'll go through my history a little bit, how I got involved in this.
I was just going to ask you, how were you first interested in the UFO phenomenon, and what made you first look into leaked or declassified documents with reference to UFOs?
Well, I was given a telescope when I was a boy, about 8 years old, little Tasco small telescope, and my interest in astronomy.
I had the same type of telescope, believe it or not, but I was 17.
Oh, right. And 2 years later, my dad and I built a 6-inch Newtonian reflector telescope, fairly big thing.
Yep.
It was really good. And I haven't actually seen anything. Well, I've seen satellites and stuff like that seem to do fast maneuvers and stuff like that, but nothing out of the ordinary, really. But I started reading books about it, and I found one called Invisible Residents by Ivan T. Sanderson back in 1986, I think it was. I was still at school, and this was before the internet, mind you, so I had to go to the local library, look it up on microfilm, and there was one copy in Australia in the State Library, New South Wales. So I skipped school thinking I'd have to take notes and write it down, and caught the train into Sydney. And to my surprise, I didn't know the State Library was actually a borrowing library, so I borrowed that book and read it, and it started from there.
Right.
And I actually went and saw Dr. Robert Ballard one time in Sydney in 1992. It was just after the Titanic was found. And it was at Darling Harbour. There was some historical groups there about the Titanic, and after his talk, they were asked for questions, and they were arguing over whether Captain Smith should have lent his binoculars to the Astor family. That's why they reckon they hit the iceberg. But anyway, I put my hand up and asked Dr. Ballard. In 1979, he and his team discovered a process in the Galapagos Rift called chemosynthesis, which is separate to photosynthesis, which photosynthesis requires sunlight for biological process. He found chemosynthesis, which does not need sunlight. And
so it's like a breakdown of sulfur of deep sea.
Hydrogen sulfide. Yep. So if you think of it, the whole Goldilocks theory of a planet has to be a certain distance from a star for life to form. That theory blows everything out of the water with that theory. It's geological. It's not.
So it just relies on volcanic vents and the sulfur coming out of them, the heat coming out of the volcanic vents and stuff like that. Those tube creatures.
So I asked Dr. Ballard that in front of this audience, and they all snapped around. And what's that got to do with the Titanic? And Dr. Ballard actually said, "Well, yeah, that's out of left field, but that is my most famous discovery, I believe." And he went to talk about that, which was really good.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So
and the Kennedy assassination, anyone that's seen the Zapruder film knows that's crap, that the bullet came from behind. So that's why I started looking into JFK declassification documents.
Yeah. So to kick the discussion off, I thought we might give the audience some background on how some researchers believe that JFK was assassinated. There's a tenuous link between the UFO phenomenon and the JFK assassination. And I asked you this before, but there's a researcher by the name of Robert Morningstar that believes that JFK had an interest in UFOs way back in World War II when he was posted on a spy mission to Guadalcanal in the P-109 boats. And when he was there, there's a folklore about UFOs that appear in that area. And whilst on mission, he might have got exposed to that folklore or actually seen a UFO himself. Do you know anything about that? Or
I hadn't heard that, but I did hear, because John F. Kennedy was actually a congressman before he became a senator, and I heard that almost a week after Roswell, he was informed by someone in the office of the Secretary of the Air Force, who I think was Stuart Symington at the time, about Roswell.
Yeah, I read somewhere where he was on a flight between Washington and Boston, and he was informed by the Secretary of the U.S. Air Force. Is that the person that you're talking about, or?
I believe so. Yep.
Yeah. So it's interesting that, he was informed about that as well, and that might have piqued his curiosity, certainly. Yep. So he obviously might have developed some sort of interest in UFOs, and because of his interests and his digging into the UFO phenomenon, I think he was put on the watch list by the CIA at one stage for his research into MJ12. Yep. And just basically, I'm just going to show the Eisenhower briefing document there on the left, and the document that was allegedly written by James Angleton about the John F. Kennedy's involvement with Marilyn Monroe. That this might have been pillow talk, that he divulged some information to her about the Roswell crash, and Dorothy Kilgallen is mentioned there because there was a tryst between Robert Kennedy and Monroe at that stage, and basically she wanted to get back at the Kennedys by divulging some important core secret information about UFOs to Kilgallen, and she was found deceased, I think 3 days after that memorandum was penned by Angleton.
Yep.
And there's the P-50, the P-109 boat that Kennedy was on. Sorry, did you want to say something about that document?
Just note that down the bottom it says about the death of Secretary Forrestal. John F. Kennedy accompanied Secretary Forrestal to Germany in May 1945 to look for the miracle weapons, like the Foo Fighters they thought that the Germans had.
Right.
So they were actively searching for those objects, and the miracle weapons are well known. I've got a book from 1956 that talks about them. It was a U-boat 977, I think, that made it to Argentina. That the captain of that U-boat mentions miracle weapons. So they were a thing back then, and whether they found them or not, it's probably what led into Paperclip, Operation Paperclip, recruiting all the scientists to work on it. So
yeah, apparently Kennedy was mentored by Forrestal, I believe.
Yep. Yeah, there's a nice photo of John F. Kennedy standing at Forrestal's grave in Arlington.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so in February, going back to February the 2nd, 1961, it's alleged that there was a flyover of UFOs over Europe, and I don't have a source for that, so I've tried to search that, the details of that, but there's not much written about it. But apparently there was a flyover over Eastern Europe, Germany, France, UK, and then they turned north towards Norway and Finland, and then back to the USSR. So I think Kennedy was in office in that time as president, and I think NATO had notified him about the incident. So he became quite concerned about the fact that the Yanks could actually mistake that for Russian nuclear missiles.
Yep.
And so he then, I think, contacted Khrushchev at the time, or was it Khrushchev? I think Khrushchev.
Yep.
I think, yeah.
Yep.
So I think that might have triggered his inquiry many years ago about UFO data from the CIA, NSA, NASA, etc. But he got stonewalled, I believe.
Yep.
Do you know much about how he was involved?
Well, I just saw an interview with Robert Kennedy Jr. I think it was about 2 months ago, where he remembers a red phone at Hyannisport that was a direct connection to Khrushchev.
Yeah, the hotline. Yep.
Yeah, but it didn't go through the normal switch infrastructure.
Yeah.
So yeah, they were both concerned. I think Khrushchev had the same problems that Kennedy did, like a vast network of unelected,
they didn't get along very
bureaucrats.
well, did they? They didn't get along. I think there was a summit meeting in Vienna.
Yeah,
that he was only the first time that Kennedy actually met Khrushchev, and
because he was young too. He was young.
Yeah, Khrushchev
40.
was about 61, and he was 44 or something like that.
Yeah.
And Khrushchev looked down at him and said, what's this pipsqueak, doing? President of the United States, he's so young.
Yep.
But yeah, so there was an alleged hotline call to Khrushchev, and I obviously I don't know the conversation, but there's the Guadalcanal location there, and so this is the NATO searching for UFOs on radar.
Yep.
And it brings me to this document on the left here, which is titled Classification Review of All UFO Intelligence Files Affecting National Security, dated November 12th, 1963. So as far as I'm aware, through my research, there's only one person that's actually ever found that document through a FOIA request through the CIA in 2006, and that's this guy in the middle there, William A. Lester. There is another William A. Lester. He's a PhD in chemistry, so don't confuse him with that guy. But this guy allegedly has a PhD in history at Oxford.
Yep.
And he wrote this book, Kennedy and the New Frontier, a celebration of freedom. So he's apparently the only UFO researcher or paranormal investigator that found this document, which is a bit suspicious, because I think other researchers have looked into this document. It's pretty groundbreaking if it is a real document, and pretty but there's a few things in it which a lot of researchers are skeptical about. And what are your thoughts on this, Jeff, on that document?
I'll just draw your attention to memorandum for the director, and then it's classified. That would be the director.
So why have they redacted?
That'd be counterintelligence. The director counterintelligence, which is James Jesus Angleton.
Okay, so I thought it might have been McCone, but
well, you'd think that, but then you wouldn't think they'd have to redact, like I'd just say the director, Central Intelligence Agency, if it was McCone.
Yeah, no, that's well, that's one of the arguments. Why did they redact it if everyone knows who the CIA director was in November?
They knew that Angleton had the files. And the other thing, you'll notice it's draft.
Yes.
That's a common, and General David Petraeus got caught out with his mistress, but using the model equivalent of email drafts. You never actually send it, just talk in drafts. So if it's a draft, it doesn't normally get recorded in the normal file system because it's a draft.
Right. Yeah, because that's one of the arguments, that no one else had found it apart from this guy. And also the redaction at the top there, which would indicate probably the agency that it came from.
Or the office, the office of the president.
Yeah. And who knows what's redacted further down below. I have no idea.
And you can see that handwriting. I've tried to get some examples of Angleton's handwriting or Richard Helms's handwriting.
So do you think that that's Angleton's signature there?
Well, I think it's actually Richard Helms writing that, because it says response for Colby, Angleton has MJ directive, which was the burnt memo. And you'll see the date, 20th of November 1963. So, only 3 days out from the assassination.
Right. So so what do you think of the authenticity of that document then?
I think it's fair dinkum, because they're talking about accidental misidentification of UFOs as ICBMs re-entering, and it's clear to try and differentiate between UFOs and those missiles inbound. So
it brings us to the burnt memorandum, which is this one here, which I've enhanced a bit, and I've got just the 2 pages which everyone refers to all the time. On the top we've got on the left hand side we've got the sentence where it says where is it? It says, as you must know, Lancer has made inquiries regarding our activities which cannot be allowed. Please submit your views no later than October. Your action to this matter is critical to the continuance of the group, which is referring to MJ12. Before we make a comment about that, what are your thoughts on the existence of MJ12?
Oh, definitely.
It comes up time and time again. It came up in the Eric Davies Wilson document, which was leaked from Edgar Mitchell's files, and that James Rigney found. And I know James is a friend of mine, and he obviously was given these documents by the spaceman. Well, we don't know who the spaceman is. His name's never been released. but James found them serendipitously, which is an indication that basically, it was not leaked. It was just found serendipitously, because these documents were going to be thrown out by his children, when he passed away in 2013, yep. I think it was.
Yep.
So it comes up there. It comes up in a number of different places, and so it's just a matter of trying to work out which documents that refer to MJ12 are real or not, authentic or not. So basically, Lancer was his code name for the CIA. Is that correct? Or
yep, that was what the Secret Service referred him. That was his code name. Yep.
Yeah, and so this other right-hand document says, when conditions, this is what I find extremely interesting, this one here, when conditions become non-conducive for growth in our environment and Washington cannot be influenced any further, the weather is lacking in any precipitation, it should be wet.
Yep.
So the last sentence, so like as a euphemism for an assassination because of wet works. I think it's the Soviet term that they use to say that this guy has to be, removed, or assassinated. So a bit of a smoking gun sort of document. Pardon the pun.
Yep.
Pardon the pun. Document.
Yeah.
So any thoughts? Any further thoughts on?
First of all, the Mary Ferrell website is an excellent resource, and there's a page there that's CIA cryptonyms.
Sorry, can you repeat that? The actual name?
Mary Ferrell Foundation.
Mary Ferrell.
She was interested in the whole assassination thing, and Jefferson Morley is a well-known JFK researcher. I think he runs that website now. But the CIA used what they call cryptonyms for documents and projects. If you have a look, they didn't use MI because that was confusing. It could have been confused as MI, as in MI5 or MI6 UK or M1. So they didn't use that cryptonym, but they used MK. And they tried to hide MK as part of the MK Ultra program, but they destroyed all the documents except for one.
So what does the MK stand for?
That's just the cryptonym that they use. It's just a identifier.
Right.
So it doesn't actually stand for anything.
Okay.
But some people say mind control, but it was just MK. MK Ultra was the project name. There was also MK Naomi and other projects, but they destroyed all the documents except for one, and that MK cryptonym, and it was part of the accounting department where they'd assigned funds to the MK, and that came out in the church committee, I believe. So they got caught with that one. They tried to hide the fact that there was a cryptonym called MK. The next one is MJ,
Right.
So going off that, it makes sense. And you'll see on the left-hand side, it says, do not remove from safe.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that says authority of JJA, which is James Jesus Angleton.
Angleton, yeah.
And it's on the far left, it's got original carbon. So after the church... So
basically, Angleton would have filed this in his personal safe, and plus the other memorandum that we just saw.
He had a mass of safes. He had over 40 safes, and when he was forced to resign, it took them 5 years to go through. A lot of people didn't know what the combinations were. They had to crack the safes.
Right.
That was under a guy named Cleveland Cram, who was in charge of going through all the files and throwing out what they didn't need, because it was a separate system, completely separate from the rest of the CIA.
Right. So obviously, yeah. So no, if you lodged a FOIA or whatever, it was if it's a classified document, you couldn't really get it via FOIA anyway. But basically, what you're saying is that there was a separate system that Angleton had, which didn't go into circulation even within the CIA.
Yeah, and it took them 5 years to go through everything, and they were burning most of it, and that's...
So this was the CIA after his death, or that were going into these safes, his safes, and then burning the documents?
This was after he retired. He was forced to resign in 1974, I believe. He died in 1987, so the guy that took after him was named Tom Karkanaris, and there's a really good website about what he described as Angleton's amazing own sort of file system that took him 5 years to go through. And he said, he's quoted as saying there was some bizarre things that I shall never speak of in them files. So
right, so there could be some documents that are still not in circulation in the UFO community and stuff like that.
And that's where the story of this one getting snatched from the fire comes from, and that's why it's burnt. You know, they tried to burn it. Someone had second thoughts and snatched it.
Yeah, and I watched a documentary as well where Robert Spearing, I know Robert Spearing fairly well. He's a MUFON guy, and he mentions in that documentary that they did testing on the red ink stamp MJ12, and they did, I don't know, gas chromatography or something on it. And basically, it was proven to have been the ink that they used in the 60s. So that's further proof that, you know, like that the document is genuine. And just going back to JFK and excuse me, his interest in UFOs and how you know, they could be mistaken for Russian missiles, and so basically I heard Nick Pope mention something that you know, if when Kennedy was pushing for documents and data from the CIA, so that he had a handle on the UFO situation, that if they gave him all the documents, they'd have to give him the data about the and the records about captured craft and crashed craft, and that they were trying to reverse engineer. And obviously, you know, why would the United States want to share that information with the Russians? Because, and it goes back to Grush as well. His David Grush's recent testimony under oath in Congress recently, where he said that, you know, there are crash craft and there is a Cold War between Russia, China, and America, trying to reverse engineer this stuff, and that sort of like makes sense to me. That you know, that'd be a big no-no to try and, you know, like share that with any other superpower.
Yep. And as we know, that ace they had up their sleeve of only telling the president what they need to know, well, Kennedy already knew, so they'd lost that advantage with him. I'll just point out that tab C on the right-hand side, DOD 5200.1, I believe that's a reference to the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 as well.
So is that back in that other document, or?
This one here on the burnt memo. See, on the left-hand side, it's got tab C.
Tab C, yep, there.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, DOD 5200.1. So that's a reference to the Atomic Energy Act of 54?
I believe so. The AEC, Atomic Energy Commission, now the Department of Energy, of course, it's like a Russian doll of within the AEC. There was a thing called the Director of Military Applications, and so it was an Atomic Energy Commission with flag general in charge of the DMA, which hid, like, you needed a Q clearance, but you also needed a defense clearance. So that's how that obfuscation comes in, like a Russian doll. You know, it's compartmented within one agency. It's defense, but it's not defense, sort of thing. Yeah.
So so Kennedy wanted an interim report from the CIA by the 1st of February 64, and obviously he never lived to see it. Because he was assassinated before then. So let me just advance this. So we've got Dulles on the left and Nixon on the right. Let's talk about let's talk about Watergate and what your theories are behind the Watergate scandal and what it was stated as being a robbery, a break-in for money by Nixon. What are your thoughts on Watergate, and how does it relate to this UFO phenomenon?
Well, this pinch is interesting because in 1957, President Eisenhower suffered a stroke and was incapacitated for several weeks. So Richard Nixon, as the vice president, actually took over. And during that time, Alan Dulles was director of Central Intelligence, but another person that was well known to Alan Dulles was John McCone. John McCone was the commissioner of the Atomic Energy Commission at that time. And there's a event called the NUMEC event where some highly enriched uranium was stolen from a factory that was producing fuel for Project Orion, which was a nuclear rocket engine. So one thing with nuclear rocket engines is it burns uranium. A nuclear weapon explodes uranium, so you'd have to have a very, very deep access to get nuclear weapons material. But if you're actually using the same material for burning in a rocket engine, it's harder to track where that material went. Something like 200 pounds went missing from the NUMEC factory in Pennsylvania in 1958, I believe it was, when John McCone was on the Atomic Energy Commission, Alan Dulles was DCI, and Richard Nixon was acting as president. So there's two sides of the story. After the Suez War in 1956, apparently the Eisenhower administration decided to covertly supply Israel with nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. And these two guys, plus McCone, facilitated that. So and we can see that because there's an enormous amount of CIA officers that had no real connection with nuclear weapons, all had Q clearances. That's come out in the December release of the JFK assassination files. Like, why would they need Q clearances? So, in particular, it was the first scientist the CIA ever recruited was a guy named David L. Christ. His background was applied physics. He got his Q clearance pretty much straight away in 1951, and he worked. His official role was an audio security engineer, and he worked overseas for some time. Doesn't say where. His boss was a guy named James P. O'Connell, also had a Q clearance, and Dave Christ recruited another scientist by the name of James McCord, who was also supposedly an audio engineer but had a Q clearance. And in Angleton's church committee testimony, he stated that he used McCord twice for a 2-year assignment in Frankfurt, Germany, that had to have watertight security and absolutely no leaks. And he used him a second time, he said in his testimony, and McCord made a mistake. So with Dave Christ, he was trying to implant an audio bug in a hotel in Cuba in Havana in August 1960. He couldn't get funds for whatever reason to get someone else to do the job for him. So he went in, installed the bug himself and came out. They had problems with the bug. Went back in September to fix the bug. It still didn't work. So in December 1960, he and two other CIA guys and a State Department guy went back in to fix the bug. And by this time, the Cubans were suspicious and arrested them all. So, you've got this guy that's got all this knowledge in his head about nuclear weapons and possibly nuclear propulsion systems, because at the time, from 1947 to 1951, there was a project called the NEPA project, which was nuclear energy for propulsion of aircrafts. And it was headed by none other than General Curtis LeMay, because they wanted a bomber with almost unlimited range. That's what they were working on. And I believe possibly they'd found a nuclear propulsion system in either Roswell, Aztec, or any of the other, maybe the Milan crash, 1933.
Do you think that the craft would have been using nuclear propulsion systems? We like, if you go back to Bob Lazar, I'll get your opinion of Bob Lazar in a minute, but he was talking about an element 115, which is used in an antimatter reactor. So it seems that like nuclear propulsion would be something that they like extraterrestrials would seem to be quite primitive. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess if we had 5 fighter aircraft from World War II and examined every engine, you'd have some Merlins, you'd have some Allison V-1710s, you'd have some rotary engines.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah, so they could have
different. They could be from different places, different technologies, but I believe we were trying to reverse engineer that technology to get we just couldn't figure it out, basically.
So what you're saying is that there could have been one craft from somewhere that used this technology, and they were trying to reverse engineer that.
Yep. And that's where David Christ was a problem, because he got captured, and 2 days after he got captured, journalist Seymour Hersh said that John McCone, who was head of the AEC, leaked a story to a New York Times reporter that the Israelis were trying to get an atomic weapon, so that they were trying to get ahead of the story in case it came out that David Christ had talked. So it's believed the Cubans did get something out. The CIA said that David Christ maintained his cover the whole time, but then they refused to let him leave the country ever for the rest of his life, which was odd. So how that ties into Watergate?
How does that tie into Watergate?
Douglas Caddy he worked at a place called Mullen Corporation, which was a CIA front. It had ties into United Fruit down in Havana, and the whole thing where the US weren't happy about the Cuban Revolution and they lost a lot of money. So Douglas Caddy was a lawyer for Mullen Company, and another guy that started working there, his name was E. Howard Hunt. E. Howard Hunt wrote copy for the Mullen Company, and this was 1968. Hunt, of course, was well known as the CIA's, I think even Mission Impossible, Ethan Hunt is sort of named after him.
Right.
He was a bit of a everywhere man. So Doug Caddy knew E. Howard Hunt from his days working at Mullen. When the Watergate plumbers got arrested, E. Howard Hunt called Doug Caddy to represent him initially. So there's I think it's called The Dark Journalist. He has a very good interview of Doug Caddy. Caddy didn't represent him during Watergate, but stayed in touch and was friends and knew Hunt's wife, Dorothy.
So he didn't represent him in Watergate.
Initially, when he got arrested, he got called down to the station to represent him, and then as lawyers do, they hand it over to someone that's probably more.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah.
So Doug Caddy knew Howard Hunt's wife, Dorothy, who was also ex-CIA and I believe was trying to extort the Nixon administration. She was killed in a plane crash along with...
Yep.
Yep.
But there were some documents on that plane as well, wasn't there?
I believe so. There was 50 FBI agents crawling through the wreckage before the fire brigade arrived, So,
yeah.
But Doug relates the story of the last time he saw Howard. Howard had been found guilty and was going to go to prison. And strangely enough, Howard Hunt was incarcerated at a little place in Florida called Eglin Air Force Base, believe it or not.
Yeah. Just recent information about Eglin.
Yeah. So Doug had dinner with Howard just before he went to prison and talking over Watergate, and Doug sort of said, Howard, I just don't get why you went into the Watergate, just for, what reason? And Hunt said there were some Cuban government documents that implicated President Nixon with the JFK assassination. And Cuddy's gone, what's the connection there? And Hunt just held his hands up and didn't want to elaborate any further. And then, so they finished the meal, walked out on the pavement and said goodbye. And Caddy thought, I'll give it one more shot. And he goes, why was Kennedy assassinated, And Hunt turned around and said he was about to give the Soviets our most vital secret.
Yeah.
And Doug's gone, what? That sounds weird. What could that be? And that's when Hunt leaned forward and said, the alien presence.
Yeah.
And so Hunt and James McCord, who had that Q clearance, he was one of the burglars arrested in Watergate. So I think they were trying to find those documents that the Cubans had extracted under torture from Dave Christ about the nuclear weapons program and reverse propulsion technology.
So
Nixon had authorized it.
Yeah, so the break-in was just a cover story for the Warren Commission, I suppose.
Well, the Warren Commission was before for the Church Commission, but
the Church Commission, sorry.
They did try and break in to look for those reports, and that's why Frank Sturgis and Bernie Barker, they were Cubans, so they probably needed translators with them to go in to read documents, and have James McCord, because of his Q clearance, would have known about nuclear weapons terminology. That's because they were a very, very odd bunch to choose to go in, for a break-in.
Yeah, and so that brings me to up to date with this next memorandum that I'm going to show, which is the terse memorandum. So recently you had gone through some of the recent files that were released, I think last year, and found an entry in Dulles' diary about meeting Kennedy wanting to meet Dulles on two occasions at 12 o'clock and 3:30 on the 28th of June 1961.
Yep.
So you made a connection between that and somebody implicating that Kennedy was trying to get more information about MJ-12 at that stage.
That was the only day I could find that he met the president twice in one day by himself. So that for the hoaxer,
terse memo dated the same date, isn't it? 28. Is that the 28th of June 1961?
It'd be an insane coincidence for someone to guess that date as the only day in Dulles' calendar from 1959.
So if somebody faked this memo that I'm showing you now, they wouldn't have had access to Dulles' to Dulles' diary.
It was classified top secret up until December last year.
Right.
So you'd have to have a high clearance to have access to that diary.
Mm. And so that was a bit of a stroke of genius on your behalf.
Yeah, just curious. just to see who. Hunt actually visited Dulles a couple of times. Bill Harvey, who ZR rifle was the assassination program of foreign nationals, apparently. There's quite a few interesting people that went in and out Alan Dulles' office.
And what? So this memorandums ended up in the excuse me, the MJ12 archives of the Woods, Bob and Ryan, his son.
Yep.
That's where I found it.
Yep.
So it's obviously got Kennedy's signature on the bottom, but it's they say it's made by an auto pen. I don't know what an auto pen is. And they're saying that it looks genuine. This is according to the Woods.
Yeah.
And also they just mentioned it mentions psychological warfare. The CIA knew about it and were involved in psychological warfare. What does this actually mean? So it's a review of MJ12 intelligence operation as they relate to Cold War psychological warfare plan.
Yep.
Sorry, what does that mean? Because I'm confused about the subject matter.
Well, 1961 was an interesting year because the Soviets had somehow developed atomic weaponry, and we know that's from leaks in the Manhattan Project, but they'd also were well on their way to developing a hydrogen bomb, which the Americans hadn't actually detonated at that time. So actually they had in 1954, but
was that the Tsar or the
Tsar bomber?
Tsar
bomber. They worked that out somehow by themselves, but we think it was Kim Philby that helped them. But so how many weapons they had and what sort of platforms they were launching them on, because there was a thing called the fractional orbital bombardment system, which was basically nuclear warheads on a orbiting platform that could be deployed in literally seconds. You'd have no warning time.
What do you mean by orbiting platform, like a satellite or something?
Yep, that's exactly what it is. So you're both using gravity and hypersonic propulsion as well. Like there'd only be 10 seconds warning time, if that. So that was a massive psychological edge that the Soviets had proposed at that time in 1961. So the whole nuclear thing was a massive psyop, not knowing what the other side had, basically. MJ12 might have played a part in that with stuff they'd recovered from Roswell, whether they'd made agreements in 1952 or 3 after that. It was basically a show of force over Washington in 1952. I mean, that's what the military call it, show of force.
Yeah, just going on a tangent. Sorry about this, but what are your thoughts on Roswell? They said it was a mogul. Initially said it was a weather balloon. Then the Air Force in '95, I think, changed their story to it being a mogul balloon. And I think there was a researcher that did quite a bit of work on the wind directions and that the launch of the mogul balloon that was supposed to have crashed on the Foster Ranch couldn't have crashed on the Foster Ranch, and there wasn't one. I think what was it, flight number 4, that wasn't actually released on the date that it should have been released, and it seems like a bit of a mess. I can't get my head around it. What do you think? It was a mogul balloon, or do you
Definitely a crash. Definitely.
And
it was no surprise to them because the Milan recovery, and by the way, the Angleton family were living in Milan since 1931. So
yeah, I know he's in Italy at one stage.
So James James was there, and his dad Hugh, who was also OSS in the Second World War. So the Americans already knew about that sort of stuff, I believe, well before Roswell.
And you've also got Cape Girardeau incident, which is referred to by MJ12 in some document, which I can't remember, in 41. So it's odd to me that, the Air Force released that press release if they knew about UFOs and had crashed material, that they would have released that, the press release in 47 when the Roswell crash happened.
Well, I think that's a result of compartmentalization. Like Colonel Blanchard had no idea any of that was going on at the time.
I see. Yeah, that's a good explanation. Yeah,
he got relieved of duty the next day.
Yeah.
So, and then Twining comes out with his Twining memo, which Harry Turner referenced. Which is
that the Cutler Twining memo, or
no? This is
another one. Yeah.
The one where Twining says UFOs are not visionary or fictitious.
Right.
Harry Turner references that one, but he also had the White Hot report.
So just go back. So a lot of the listeners won't know about Harry Turner. So he was an Australian.
Yep. Australian nuclear scientist. Actually, Bill Chalker is the expert. He actually spoke, and Keith Basterfield.
Bill met him. Yeah.
Yeah. He wrote this report in 1971 that basically, that's when I read that report. That's what made me get on Reddit with that handle, Harry is White Hot, because Harry Turner references Twining's secret memo, which is what you'd normally do as a limited hangout for your allies. Send a document that's classified secret and just give the general thing, oh yeah, these things are real. But then
how did Harry Turner get his hands on that document? Considering it
must have been delivered, because it wasn't no form. It was a secret document, but didn't have dissemination limitations on it. So it would have gone to the British and Canadians, possibly through to Australia through.
We didn't have
British.
Five Eyes then, did we? Or
no, we had Yakuza, which was from Bletchley Park. So Mark Oliphant worked on the Manhattan Project. Harry Turner worked with him on the Maralinga nuclear tests, but Bill Chalker tells me the Australians weren't allowed anywhere near the actual device because they were testing a hydrogen bomb triggers, and they weren't supposed to do that. Yep. Yeah. So none of the Australians were allowed to get involved in the British tests once the device was in place. So Harry Turner was well placed to get that secret memo from Twining.
Right.
Twining got moved to Alaska for 3 years for his efforts after that, because I reckon they were cranky that he'd sort of spilled the beans in the secret memo. But the White Hot report that is a majestic document. That was no form for no foreign eyes at all.
Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of it here, but
and it describes what they call unidentified lenticular aerodyne technology, which is
it's interesting that they didn't call them UFOs or anything like that. It was just a completely different name for these objects, which sort of like gives it a bit more credibility, I guess, in those documents. Yeah.
So there's a number of things that point to these documents actually being authentic. Some are probably, implanted misinformation, but the majority of them I believe are legit.
Yeah, and I've just got here your statement on Reddit about the Alan Dulles' diary and why you thought it probably wasn't hoaxed. And there we've got Eisenhower signing the Atomic Energy Act in 1954. And recently, Chuck Schumer, Senator Chuck Schumer had proposed a bill for the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2024 regarding the Atomic Energy Act 1954 and how we still can't actually access any of the data in that under the umbrella of the Atomic Energy Act 54. So he's trying to, I'll just go through this. It says unidentified anomalous phenomenon records still exist that have not been declassified or subject to mandatory declassification review due in part to exemptions under the Atomic Energy Act 1954, thereby preventing public disclosure under existing provisions of law. Legislation is necessary because freedom of information, the Freedom of Information Act has proven inadequate in achieving the timely public disclosure of government unidentified anomalous phenomenon records that are subject to mandatory declassification review. So obviously, Chuck Schumer is trying to get access to that information. Can you do you want to comment on that? Or
that's that Russian doll effect I was talking about with the Division of Military Applications, a defence arm of the Department of Energy that is sort of, it's not overarching run by the Defence Department. It's a flagged defence officer in charge of that, and that's how they, the whole Title 10, Title 50. They don't know which is it Title 10 or is it Title 50? And
so I mean, is it neither? I mean,
possibly, yeah. Ross Coulthart said the other day the only agency in the Defence Department that can actually access both Title 10, Title 50 is, he called it the DCI, which I think it's a Directorate of Counterintelligence for the, I think it's the US Army. So there's a very, very small number of people that can actually have access to that, because they always say if you don't have a need to know, you won't get access. And that's where the presidents run into trouble, because they're viewed as temporary employees, maximum 8-year term. So
that's right. And
and
so that brings us to this document, the MJ12 project. So signed by Dulles, where I'll just read it. The remaining cases have been classified for security reasons under review, while the possibility remains that true UFO cases of non-terrestrial origin, US intelligence is of the opinion that they don't constitute a physical threat to national defense. For reasons of security, I cannot divulge pertinent data on some of the more sensitive aspects of MJ12 activities which have been deemed properly classified under the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. So what Dulles is saying there is that this is a directive to a letter to MJ12, is it? Or
this is to the president.
Oh, this is to the president. Okay.
This is
November 61. So this is
the response to that June 28th request. So it's taken him what?
So this went to Kennedy?
Yep.
So he's mentioned MJ12 in it.
This is a majestic document, so it's never been found in any of the archives, but just imagine your fury when you're the commander-in-chief of all the military forces of the US and someone tell, we can't tell you that because you don't have a need to know.
So he's acknowledging the existence of MJ12 by giving this to the president.
Well, I think Kennedy already knew. That's why he said, I want to know about MJ12, Dulles gets forced to resign 10 days after this document was received. No guesses for why, but...
So how does the Bay of Pigs fiasco play into his forced resignation as compared to this document, where he won't give any information about UFOs because of they're under the umbrella of the Atomic Energy Act?
Well, the Bay of Pigs
was a combination of both.
Yeah, the Bay of Pigs was done completely behind Kennedy's back, and he got suckered into that one. Yeah. Kennedy was furious with the Israelis for the Dimona nuclear plant where they were, building nuclear weapons. he had a massive run-in with the short Israeli Prime Minister. I forget his name at the moment. And the Prime Minister actually resigned over it. So Dulles, McCone, and probably Nixon were working behind his back with that as well.
Right.
And now, the MJ12. Oh yeah, we've got some operations going, but we can't tell you.
So it could have been a combination of different things that Kennedy then put the hard word on Dulles to resign.
Ben Gurion was the Israeli.
Oh, Ben Gurion. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. So, and so now going into the high altitude nuclear weapons explosions. You mentioned something in Reddit where the video photographs and any reports on high altitude nuclear weapon explosions was originally classified, and it was coming up to say 50 years where it had needed to be reviewed, and then it was reclassified by the DoD for another 50 years. What's your belief as to why the DoD had further extended that classified period for these high altitude nuclear explosions that happened in the 60s?
That classification one on the left is from 2005.
Yep. So after 2005, they reclassified the
one on the right's on 2012. Yeah, and the reason I believe that happened was because of discrepancies in classification levels between two different laboratories that did not get on because of the J. Robert Oppenheimer, Edward Teller fallout. Basically, the two labs are obviously the Los Alamos.
Oppenheimer was in Los Alamos, and Teller was in
Lawrence Livermore.
Lawrence Livermore, right?
Yep. Yeah. So.
Okay. And so Los Alamos has got. So we're going to be looking at a particular explosion, the high altitude explosion called Bluegill Triple Prime.
Yeah.
What do they mean by prime? Is it a failed explosion, or
it failed 3 times before that?
Failed, so that's why it's called Triple Prime.
Yep. It's Starfish Prime.
So what
is called Starfish Prime because the first one failed. So. Yeah.
Okay. So is there any explanation as to why it failed 3 times? Or?
Well, is it Lieutenant Colonel Lauren Dietrich?
Yeah.
Yeah, I only saw it the other day, a video of him saying that nuclear weapons in space are a big no-no with the visitors. And that they got deliberately taken out.
Yeah. So there was a video of that I can show in a minute of an object falling out of is it an X-ray? Oh, hang on. Oh, there's several different videos, but I think the one I've got is an X-ray image video of the explosion.
Yeah.
So if I just so these are photographs. So on the left we've got Kettle 1 and Kettle 2. So what can you explain what Kettle 1 and Kettle 2 are?
So they were fully instrumented KC-135 aircrafts there was 3 of them.
So there's 2 separate aircraft, at different locations, or
there's actually 3, yeah. KC.
So there's 3.
The Kettle 1 and Kettle 2 were 50 nautical miles apart and almost directly under the fireball, under the blast. This blast was at 48 kilometers altitude. And the third one was at the conjugate point, which is the opposite end of the magnetic field on the Earth's surface, which for this was at Johnson Island, or Johnson Atoll as it's now known. Yep. So the conjugate point was near Fiji on that south. One of them,
this explosion happened in 61.
1962, 25th of
sorry.
October.
Yep.
Right in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, this happened.
Right.
So all three aircraft were crewed by EG&G employees because they were the experts in high-speed photography. Harold Doc Edgerton, who is the pioneer of high-speed photography, he's the E in EE&G. It was his company. He actually designed the firing mechanism of the Trinity nuclear weapon because he knew about fast shooting circuits and stuff. So EG&G were contracted to capture this data from an aircraft at 30,000 feet. These two 50 nautical miles apart. Now, they were sent to different labs because there was different experts on X-ray phenomenology at Los Alamos and other weapons effects at Lawrence Livermore. So the two labs each got one of, I'm not sure which is which, but they got sent this to analyse, which they did. They wrote several reports which are still classified as restricted data. And that's why I believe you'll see later on there's a big white triangle on this Kettle 2 imagery that's pretty much from where that object...
see some of the triangle there, the sanitised section here.
Yep.
So the sanitised section was taken out, the video was taken from Kettle 2.
Yep. But whoever
and
decided...
Also you could see it from both the Kettle 1 and Kettle 2, yeah.
Yep. So this is absolutely super high-speed photography. Every 15 seconds of the footage is like 1 second of real time.
Right.
And what's interesting is on the Kettle 1 imagery, the photographer or the cameraman actually moves the camera away from the fireball to see what that thing was.
Yes, I've seen that footage, yeah.
Yeah. They would have lost money over that because he was contracted to film the first microseconds of that nuclear explosion, and they took it off to see what that thing was.
Yeah. So we've got an unredacted photograph here from Kettle 1.
Yep.
Was that from Los Alamos?
I'm not sure which one did which, and they've got a application with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies to actually approach, because there's a project at the moment to restore and declassify nuclear tests from Operation Dominic, which was the overarching.
So this is in Lawrence Livermore, is it?
This was released in 1998. This footage.
No. What I meant to say is there's a project now to go back through the film footage and.
No, that's Lawrence Livermore that are doing that. Yep.
Yeah, Lawrence Livermore. Yeah.
But there's scientists from Los Alamos working on that project.
Right.
Yeah, I've spoken to a few of them.
Well, let's look at a video of this. So this video footage will show that object falling out of this fireball.
Yeah.
So I'll just play that. So you can see this object coming down. So I'll just play it again. Wait a second. I'll just play that again.
I've slowed this down too a lot.
Yeah. So you can obviously see an object falling out of the fireball, but how far away? Do you know how far away this is? Like, where is this? Is this the Kettle 1 footage, or is it?
Yep, that's that nuclear fireball. The radius is about 500 meters.
So 500 meters, okay. Yeah, and so how far away? How far away was Kettle 1 from the actual fireball?
It was at 30,000 feet, and the detonation was at 48 kilometers. So yeah, I'm not sure what's that. About 10 kilometers height.
10 kilometers.
So it would have been probably 38 kilometers away.
38 kilometers away. So that object looks enormous.
Yeah. Yep.
So what are your estimates as to, like, I mean, if you did just a ballpark estimate of the size of the object?
Yeah, probably not sure, 50 to 100 meters across or something.
Right. So what makes you think that's a UFO? Like, why say that that's, like, I mean, could it be something off the warhead, like that's just broken off and fallen? I mean, I don't know. I just, could there be a prosaic explanation for that object?
It could be, but it wouldn't explain why the other image was classified, like sanitized,
Yeah.
That you're talking about tens of millions of degrees inside that nuclear fireball, and the shock wave is traveling at like 100 Mach, like that's 120 kilometers an hour or something like that. And you'll see that in the Kettle 2 footage.
So if it was anything that was man-made, it would have just evaporated.
Yep.
And so this thing didn't evaporate. So it was near the fireball.
Yep.
And then it got knocked out.
Yep.
Where it should have been evaporated into smithereens.
Yep. But what is interesting is that if it was using some type of electromagnetic propulsion off the Earth's magnetic fields, these high-altitude nuclear tests actually push out the Earth's magnetic fields for up to 15 seconds. So
yeah, and that's what happened here, didn't it?
Possibly could have. And I don't know if you've seen Lou Elizondo. I think it was James Iandoli's interview, and he said that there has been instances in the past where around nuclear weapons, gravity takes an effect, and these things fall like a brick, basically.
Mm.
And Tom DeLonge actually mentioned something like this in a radio interview in 2016 with Jimmy Church, but Tom didn't know that his emails had been hacked in the DNC hack. And that came out 10 days later, and he said he got the name wrong. He called it Starfish Prime, but he got the date right. He said 25th of October 1962, the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And as we know from the WikiLeaks, he was talking with General Neil McCaslin and John Podesta.
Yeah.
So maybe he accidentally spilled the beans there without knowing that his sources were going to get revealed.
Yeah. And so up the top here, I've just got the photographs that were posted on Reddit, where on the top right-hand corner here, we've got the redacted area for Bluegill Triple Prime on October 25th, 1962, whereas this is not a common practice. I mean, usually there's no redactions of the videos or anything. So this happened in Lawrence Livermore, where they tried to redact that area where that object was falling for some strange reason.
Well, I don't know if it was Lawrence Livermore, but we're because they're doing the project now to restore, because they're all still on acetate film. They're digitizing all the film. So we've proposed to get the SCU as an official body to ask them if they can look at redacting that or removing that redaction.
Right.
And the reason Starfish Prime isn't included in this is because the X-ray effects actually impact the atmosphere, and that's how you can get these X-ray phenomenology effects. Because Starfish Prime was 400 kilometers, it was exo-atmospheric, so they couldn't get any good X-ray data, but they did get some excellent magnetic field data from Starfish Prime, which, when they ran the data again through a modern-day supercomputer in 2006, found that a massive amount of the Earth's magnetic field was removed for up to 16 seconds. And this goes into the unified theory, field theory, where gravity could be inversely proportional to the Earth's magnetic field. So if you remove the Earth's magnetic field for a brief period of time, maybe gravity is amplified more, and that's what caused the object to crash,
to fall so quickly as well.
Yeah, because it appears, because this is high speed film, it looks like it's falling faster than 9.8 meters per second, which is the normal acceleration due to gravity.
Yeah.
So that it's if they hadn't have blocked this out, I probably would not have looked into it as much.
Yeah.
Okay? And I've actually spoken to a scientist that witnessed that event and wrote reports. He can't explain why it's still sanitized.
Yeah. And so this object crashed into the ocean, is that right?
That's correct. This is Roswell's version, U.S. Navy's version of Roswell.
Right.
Because
so can you explain what's going on here? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, five battleship, what look like battleships.
Yep.
In the vicinity of Johnson Island.
Yep.
And obviously they would have. Did they see the object crash into the ocean of the ships, or?
All the events happened at midnight, all the high altitude blasts, so they could see the auroral effects better.
Yeah.
As these missiles, and we have to remember that the nuclear blast was at 48 kilometers, but the missile actually went up about as high as 1,000 kilometers and then deployed a re-entry vehicle like a normal nuclear weapon would. And then the re-entry vehicle re-entered the atmosphere and exploded at 48 kilometers.
Right.
On its flight, there was three pods on the outside of the missile that deployed via parachute that were full of instruments measuring stuff that were deployed at various points away from the fireball. There's 3 separate reports that I've seen that said all the instrumentation pods were recovered successfully. There was no malfunctions in, like, if you'd expect if one got caught in the fireball and fell to the ground. They also fired small rockets.
So they recovered those instrumentation
pods. They did, yep.
Yeah.
And the logs, the US
all
Navy logs, yep.
Yep.
The US Navy logs document those recoveries, but also...
Yeah, that's these logs here.
Yep. You'll see the transferring experimental pod and that top there. This is the Engage is the middle one. The top one is the USS John S. McCain. So they're recovering those pods, but then you'll see in the middle one, the Engage, it says spotted a black ball in the water.
So they obviously didn't see it, but they found something close to the pods, or?
Yeah, that the pods aren't balls; they're like bell shaped. So, and they've recovered.
So they're completely wrong shape. Yeah.
Yeah, they've recovered heaps of them before, so it's unusual that they put that in the log.
Yeah.
And then the bottom one is the USS Safeguard. At the same time that this is all happening, it's tried to hoist the pod into the ship, and it lost all power when it did so momentarily. And they're DC ships.
Sorry, say that again. I didn't quite understand that. So
these 3 logs are all documenting the same recovery incident. So the Engager said it spotted a black ball in the water.
Oh, yeah, I know that. But when you said that when they were taking the pods back into the ship,
yep,
that's the instrument.
That's another ship, the Safeguard, that was working with Engage and the McCain. As they hoisted it in the net, lost all ship's power momentarily.
So sorry, was that the pod or was it the black ball?
Well, I'm not sure. It's at the same time. So, yeah, they're hauling it into the water at, was it 8:16? And that they've recovered. It was around that time where they spotted the black ball. So
do you think that the black ball might have affected the electromagnetics on the ships or something like that?
Yeah, it was interesting because the Safeguard was a DC powered ship. Its generators produced a direct current electricity. Yeah. And you got to remember, I think the reason these logs have words in them, like the McCain was a big capital ship. These other 2 ships are smaller with smaller crews. That's why they're handwritten. So they're probably reluctant to put too much information into the logs.
Yeah. And so you mentioned something about it being something similar to a bed Tibet sphere, which
possibly, yeah, black
yeah,
ball, and it was highly radioactive, so it wasn't just flotsam from generally floating around the ocean.
So they did some tests on it, and they found
Yep.
it to be highly radioactive. What became of this thing?
Not sure, but if you go back to that other slide with all the ship locations,
yep.
So those 3 ships are the ones, the Engage, the John S. McCain, and the Safeguard. Those were the ones in that initial recovery.
Yep.
But 2 days later, the Safeguard and this other ship down here. Yep, the USNS Point Barrow. That is a very, very specialised ship. It was used in a recovery effort with the Safeguard for 3 days after that, and there was another nuclear test going on, but they moved it further south so that these operations, this recovery operation, could continue. And there was a report done in the 1980s because they were, I guess, all the people that were involved in Operation Dominic and the sub-project called Operation Fishbowl, which was the high-altitude nuclear tests, a lot of them were getting cancer. So the US government got a company that was actually involved in the test in the 1960s to write a report about exposure levels to radiation. The US and the Point Barrow, its logs have never been found. They've gone missing. But it had no roles during the whole fishbowl project that needed it to get up close and personal to any radioactive materials. But this report that was written in the 1980s found that ship had the second highest crew exposure to radiation than any other of the whole. There's 75 ships, and it had no official duties that needed it exposure to radiation. And we only know it was involved in a recovery effort because of the Safeguard logs, because it mentions Point Barrow in the Safeguard logs on a special recovery mission that you could sink the Point Barrow in the water and float stuff into the back end of it. It was a specialised ship, and the Safeguard had a big hoist on the back. And in the deck logs, during this 3-day recovery operation after the shot, the Bluegill triple prime shot, the command moved from the bridge of the Safeguard back to the back deck because they were trying to recover this object, and the XO was driving the ship from the aft, or the fantail as they call it, as part of the recovery operations. And this USS Henry County ship, members on board that ship were deployed for a special security operation on Johnson Island at that time. So they'd obviously recovered debris, and even the USS Engage and Safeguard transferred the debris to the John S. McCain, and then the USS Princeton, which was the flagship of the whole fleet, came and did a fuel transfer later that day. And on the John S. McCain logs and the Princeton logs, it just says, it's a fuel transfer, but the Safeguard logs actually says debris transferred to Princeton.
Right, so that's that thing that they found in the ocean that was transferred.
Yep. And then you got the special security operation on Johnston Island in the days after that. So, yeah, it's definitely, I'd call it the US Navy's Roswell event.
Yeah. And so I've got a photograph here of the 3 tramps. How does this factor into our discussion?
Well, this is taken on the day of the JFK assassination. Some interesting things here. You see the guy with the suit walking past.
Walking, yeah, you can't see his face yet.
If you're in that situation, you saw 2 guys with shotguns, 2 policemen with shotguns escorting. Yeah, you can't see E. Howard Hunt behind Carswell there. The guy in the suit is General Lansdale, and people have zoomed in on his left hand. He's got a West Point ring, big ring on his finger.
Right.
He's walking directly past E. Howard Hunt, and just to say everything's sorted, just.
So the first guy here is E. Howard Hunt?
No, he's behind. You can just see his feet. Yeah.
Oh, so he's this guy here.
Yep. Yeah. So Lansdale is just walking past to say, everything's cool. We've got this sorted. We'll get you out of this. And of course, these guys were arrested, but then released later on. But the guy in the front is Frank Sturgis.
That's Frank there.
Yep. He was one of the Watergate burglars that was arrested.
Right.
So Hunt had a crew of contractors that he used. He used them on the assassination. I guess they were just spotters. And then Hunt used them again for Watergate, but they got caught. So
when was this photograph taken? Is it what was the situation here?
This was just after the assassination.
After the assassination. So just what, hours after, or?
Yep, the first 1 or 2 hours, I believe.
Right.
General Lansdale, of course, was the guy that found all the gold that the Japanese had hid in the Philippines. So I've heard estimates of trillions of dollars worth of gold that was off the books and probably helped to black budget somewhat. So, yeah, he was a bit of a superstar.
Right. And this photograph here where Tramp A looks like Carswell, is that right? Or I'm a bit confused.
I've got there's a picture of Frank Sturgis walking down the steps after Watergate, and there's a photo, like the two photos of him as the tramp, and it's exactly the same. And E. Howard Hunt's son actually saw a picture of the three tramps and recognised him immediately, and that's how his son, I think his name's St. John Hunt.
Right.
That's how he started questioning his dad. This is you. What was going on there?
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered everything, so that's great.
Pretty much.
So, look, it's fascinating talking with you, Jeff, and your knowledge is just blown me away. I mean, you've just really gone into this in great depth, and I think that like going through all this stuff, it seems to be all logical, and there's a connection there between these classified documents. And so what you're saying is that some of these documents are possibly authentic, and MJ12 is an organization that actually did exist and probably still exists today. What have you got any future plans on that you're working on at the moment? Any other documents or anything further to further knowledge of what you're researching, what you've researched before?
I've got a proposal before the board of the SCU to look into bluegill triple prime, but it's a touchy subject because a lot of the people on the SCU have security clearances still, and the national nuclear stockpile is not something that the Americans want to talk in the first place with anyone, let alone a foreign national. So a little bit difficult there, but if anyone is interested, they should read, I'll send you the link, James Jesus Angleton's Church Committee testimony, because they missed a redaction in that one. And not only was he in charge of counterintelligence, but he was also in charge of the Israeli account. And when you use that missed redaction in all their other redactions, you can easily understand what they're talking about. So, and they talk about the nuclear weapons program to Israel, because a story came out in a Penthouse magazine by Tad Zolk that alleged at the time in 1975 that Angleton was director of that Israeli weapons program. And they talk about that. But then there's a redacted portion in there And before they start talking about that, they make Angleton aware that another person has given evidence, and that other person was James P. O'Connell. So he's spilled the beans. He was head of security for the CIA during that time. He was the one that organised the family jewels #1 secret, which was human trafficking. It was his operation. He's told the church committee something that they warn Angleton before he speaks about nuclear technology to Israel that they already know, so to choose his words carefully. And there's some funny incidents in that document where there was an NSA leaker named Sergeant Jack Dunlap. He gave a lot of information from the NSA to the Soviets, and apparently they found him when it came out that he was, found out that he committed suicide using a car exhaust and carbon monoxide poisoning. And when Angleton's talking about that particular incident, he says, after his assassination, we found all these other documents, and the committee members are going, what'd you say? And Angleton froze because there was word at the time that he'd been assassinated. So Angleton slipped up there.
Yeah. Well, my head's spinning at the moment, Jeff, because it's just information overload for me. I'm a scientist and I'm not a historian or anything like that, so I'm just out of my water here. But thank you very much for talking with us. But before you go, just hang on. I'm just going to ask you another question, which I wasn't going to. But do you have any inside information about special access programs that with Grush's testimony and under oath at Congress? I tried to research this myself, but I mean, where are these special access programs located? I mean, I know that they're, we've got them in, aerospace industry. So basically, if they've got a craft, they can, obviously, we can't lodge a FOIA because it's out of the, it's not under the government jurisdiction. I know that Michael Schratt had photographed an underground entrance, and it was shown at the National Press Conference that Greer had recently, where he had his witnesses, his first-hand witnesses, where it could be a possible location underground where one of these special access programs is located under Lockheed Martin. But have you got any inside information about, where these places are kept and, what anything to do with unacknowledged special access programs and because Rush is talking about first-hand witnesses that work in them and have testified as well to not only to him but to Congress people that and so have you got any information about that's the aspect of
SAPs are everywhere. I'm not allowed to say who I work for or what level of clearance I had, but I'll give you an example.
Would there be any incline gap?
Well, they'd be definitely there, I'd reckon. Yeah, I'll give you an example. Where I used to work, we used to be involved in this project, which was a SAP. Just basically, grunt work mostly. And we went to a meeting one time. We were contractors. We went with the meeting with this government agency, and then they said, we're about to talk about Project X, so we'd like all the contractors to leave. And I looked at the guy that was our point of contact, and I sort of said to him, he just shook his head and laughed. And on the way out, I said, do they know we actually run this project? He just laughed. So they're everywhere. It just means you get briefed into certain things.
What about the USAPs? Are they located in the SAP? Like it's just a compartmentalized,
unacknowledged. Like they're just not, the accounting. I think. Well, I'm not sure that Australia has any of them, but the way that unacknowledged SAPs are, they're only the gang of eight. Yeah, only the gang of eight get alerted to their existence. The unacknowledged part is they're allowed to use cutouts, I guess, from other projects or carve-outs. That's how you get, $30,000 for a toothbrush for the Department of Defence. That's how that sort of happens. But
and would that be all underground or above ground, or
it'd be just in plain sight everywhere? Like just a normal building. Yeah.
So just a normal building, right? Okay.
You'd have to have security measures in place. You drive around any city and you see buildings with no signs, with barbed wire and all that. They leap out basically because of they're conspicuous in their security. But could be anything. But yeah.
So I mean, I'm sure that you would have seen this Reddit post where somebody had allegedly leaked some information about biologics.
Yeah,
and that went viral. I still read it because I'm a scientist, and I sort of understood most of it. I teach molecular biology and neuroscience and pathology and that. And some of the what was in the document sort of I could make sense of, if there was an extraterrestrial that they were working on. Some of that didn't quite make sense to me, especially when it referred to, certain things about the bone development and these alleged extraterrestrials. But that they gave the coordinates of the actual building that the research was allegedly taking place, and it was this building that that somebody had located in the States, and apparently, yeah. So again, it's just these, like, if that could be a special access, obviously, facility there, where it's like in the underground area, so yeah. I mean, I better cut this short because we're going over time. But yeah, I was just interested to know where these special access programs were located. So what you're saying is that they're normal buildings in plain sight, but it's compartmentalized, and that obviously there's a lot of, obviously, enormous security behind all this sort of stuff.
And the other tenants probably wouldn't even know if there were other tenants, So
yeah.
It's just a shell game, constant shell game.
And what's your belief that we have craft that we have in our possession? Well, not we, but
yeah, definitely. But that's why I'm interested. It's another form of propulsion. That's basically what I'm into, propulsion. So it's interesting.
What I was going to ask you about Bob Lazar. So what are your thoughts on Bob Lazar? Because there's a lot of, in particular, some of the well, they're not debunkers. I mean, Dean Johnson's not a debunker. I think he's a UFO researcher, but he constantly, well, he's got his blog where he's debunking Lazar, and saying that, I mean, I know a friend of mine actually worked with Lazar in the 80s, prior to his alleged involvement in his work at Los Alamos Laboratories. So he had a photo studio, of course, in Los Alamos, and he would meet him on a regular basis, and he told me that he seemed like a regular guy that like thought out of the box, and he wasn't shifty or unscrupulous. What are your thoughts on his allegations about 115 and propulsion systems relating to that, and his credibility?
Well, in researching Bluegill Triple Prime, Harold Agnew was the director of Los Alamos, and before him, Norris Bradbury was. Norris Bradbury wouldn't let Edward Teller at Los Alamos because of what happened with Oppenheimer. Agnew said when he became director in 78 or something, he changed that and got Edward Teller to come around, hang out, wander around and talk with the scientists. And that's exactly how Lazar said he mupped into Teller, because Teller was reading the newspaper with this picture of his jet car on the front.
So do you believe that Teller did actually interview for the Lazar for the job? Or?
Well, that's what Harold Agnew was saying. He deliberately got Teller down to Los Alamos to just wander around and talk with the troops, as he says it. So there's that. So that's very plausible that, out of the box guy thinking for propulsion is probably what they need. If he was working with other scientists, maybe there was some cover story made up about his qualifications and credentials, because other scientists would get their nose out of joint if someone just walked off the street. That could have been that cover story that was built. Gordon Novel wrote a letter to Office of Naval Intelligence, or a phone call actually, and there's documents that come out in the JFK files as well that Novel's told that the ONI doesn't exist anymore, and the bottom header of the document says Department of Navy Naval Intelligence. And if you ran out of room on the W-2 form, you just put Department of Naval Intelligence. That was the whole thing about his W-2 form. Not, there's no such thing as Department of Naval Intelligence. I mean, Lazar come out 34 years ago and said we've got at least 10 recovered craft. The background information, the background information that everyone delves into, that's probably your cover stories that were created for him. And it's hard to remember your cover stories because they're all so different. So if you look at the base information that he provided back then, he was right. It appears.
So what do you think of the theory of 115 decaying into shooting a proton into 115 and creating 116, and
that's a stable isotope of 115. Well,
you can't find it on Earth. I mean, but there might be a planet out in the universe, in the galaxy, or extragalactic that has 115 naturally, because it's
and it approaches that island of stability.
It approaches that island stability. But so what do you think of the way he's described the propulsion mechanism, like the little cyclotron that they've got on the
it sounds feasible.
Yeah, it sounds feasible to me too.
And that's what Bluegill Triple Prime, if there was something that was, manipulating either gravity or electromagnetism, when that blast happened, and it was possibly hanging around like what Robert Jacobs saw on that Vandenberg launch, where it was, putting beams into the warhead, doing something, and it detonated before it. Like it messed around and find out, in other words.
Yeah, that was a dummy warhead though, wasn't it?
I think so, yep.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. That's all. As far as Bob's concerned, his base statement back in the day was fairly accurate, as we found out now. So the rest of it, I don't worry too much about. But as I've said, I've stumbled across other things like Harold Agnew's testimony and Gordon Novel's response in the JFK file. So, yeah.
And what do you think of the Eric Davies Wilson?
James Clapper was the director of the DIA before Wilson, and he's the one that's played most of the shell games, I believe. He was director DIA, he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Security and Intelligence, and then he was Director of National Intelligence and a 4-star Air Force General. Ticks all the boxes.
Why do you think Wilson's not... oh, sorry, keep going.
And, he obfuscated it enough in DIA that Wilson got wind of it and, wanted to find out, and got told back off, or you lose your pension and a couple of stars.
And what do you think? Wilson's still denying it, the fact
he has to.
So
there's documents that I found from Castle Bravo and the Marines that were guarding the hydrogen bombs have been told on their debrief, you talk about this and it's execution. Now, that doesn't mean, you'll go to a court-martial and get executed. That means you're aware that we can execute you anytime, and we'll probably save the government a whole bunch of money if we just use a 10-cent bullet on the street.
So it's not a matter of you lose your pension or anything like that. It's a death threat.
Yep. And that's in verbal documents from the National Nuclear Test Museum that I've come across. So that they are not messing around.
Well, fascinating talking to you, Jeff. As I said, my mind is spinning at the moment, and I'd love to have you on another occasion. But it's been a fascinating talk. I've got to let you go, but thank you so much for this interview opportunity.
Thank
So
you, Rog.
just stay on, because I'll just gonna stop this recording, and then I'll just have a chat with you. There we go.